I reject you, Lisa. Alpha King David's voice was a low, indifferent drawl that echoed off the cold marble walls of the throne room. He didn't even blink. A king requires a queen of equal standing, not a nameless, rogue-born liability. Silence rushed into the space between them, thick and suffocating. The gathered courtiers held their breath. Lisa didn't weep. She didn't beg. The primordial mate bond snapped inside her chest, a phantom blade twisting violently through her ribs, leaving a hollow, bleeding void in its wake. Slowly, she lifted her chin. Her gaze bypassed the man the fates had chosen for her, landing squarely on the broad-shouldered warrior standing firmly in his shadow. Caleb, the king's most trusted general, his lifelong best friend. "Then I offer myself to you, Caleb," she said, her voice ringing clear like struck glass. "Claim me." And the king's indifferent mask finally, violently, cracked. The gasp that swept through the throne room was collective, a sudden vacuum of air that left the great hall feeling suffocatingly small. David's hands, previously resting with casual arrogance on the gilded armrests of his throne, gripped the stone so hard his knuckles bled white. The sharp scent of ozone and burning pine, his signature alpha aura, spiked, rolling down the dais in an invisible, crushing wave. He stared at Lisa, his dark eyes narrowing into obsidian slits. He had expected tears. He had prepared himself for her knees to hit the polished floor, for the pitiful wails of a female severed from her destined soul. He had told himself it was a necessary cruelty. The northern territories were on the brink of rebellion, his borders were bleeding, and the council demanded an alliance through marriage. Not a love match with a border town survivor who didn't know which fork to use at a state dinner. He was being a king. He was being practical. He was not prepared for her to look past him as if he were already a ghost. Caleb froze. The general was a mountain of a man, scarred and weathered, a stark contrast to David's refined, lethal elegance. For a fraction of a second, Caleb's eyes darted to his king, reading the minute tremors of rage vibrating through David's jaw. Then, his gaze dropped to Lisa. She stood trembling, not from fear, but from the physiological shock of the severing. Her pale skin was slick with a cold sweat, her breathing shallow. Yet her spine was a rod of steel. She held Caleb's gaze, offering him the raw, unvarnished truth of her desperation. By pack law, a rejected, unbonded female without family was essentially prey. Unless she was claimed by another before the sun set, she would be cast out into the wastelands, unprotected. "Lisa," David warned, his voice dropping an octave, taking on the resonant, mind-numbing command of the Alpha. "Do not make a fool of yourself. Leave the hall. I have arranged for an escort to take you to the southern borders with a generous stipend." Lisa ignored the command. The Alpha tone washed over her, pressing against her eardrums. But without the mate bond to anchor it, it was just noise. "Caleb," she repeated, her voice softer this time, wavering just a fraction. "Please." Caleb's jaw clenched. He had known Lisa for exactly 3 weeks. The 3 weeks since border patrols had brought her in, the exact moment the scent of wildflowers and rain had hit David, announcing her as the king's mate. Caleb had watched from the sidelines as David fought the pull, maintaining an icy distance, treating her like a hostage rather than a queen. Caleb had seen the quiet dignity in her, the way she didn't complain about the drafty quarters or the whispered insults from the high-born staff. He stepped out of the king's shadow. "Caleb," David snarled, rising half out of his throne. "Stand down." She invoked the right of sanctuary, my king, Caleb said, his voice a gravelly rumble that lacked its usual deference. He didn't look back at David. He kept his eyes strictly on Lisa. Ancient law dictates that any unmatched male of rank may answer. I am your king, David roared, the sound shaking the glass in the high-arched windows. Several courtiers shrank back against the tapestries, whimpering. And you are no longer her mate, Caleb replied evenly. It was a statement of fact, devoid of malice, yet it struck the room like a physical blow. Caleb reached out, his massive, calloused hand engulfing Lisa's small, trembling one. The moment their skin met, Lisa let out a ragged breath, her knees finally buckling as the adrenaline left her system. Caleb caught her effortlessly, sweeping her into his arms against his leather-clad chest. David watched, paralyzed by an entirely foreign sensation. It wasn't the burn of a broken bond. He had braced himself for that. It was a hot, feral spike of possessive rage, so intense his vision blurred with red at the edges. Where are you taking her? David demanded, his voice a dangerous, quiet hiss. To my estate, Caleb said, turning his back on the throne, an act bordering on treason. To survive the fever. As her protector. As Caleb carried her out of the heavy oak doors, the faint scent of Lisa's distress lingered in the air, mingling with the terrifying realization settling like lead in David's stomach. He had cut the tether to save his crown, but as the heavy doors slammed shut behind his best friend and his discarded mate, David felt the first, unmistakable fracture in his own sanity. Caleb's estate was everything the royal palace was not. Nestled on the edge of the king's woods, it was built of dark timber and rough-hewn stone, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and quiet solitude. There were no gilded mirrors, no whispering servants, and most importantly, no suffocating scent of the Alpha King. Lisa barely remembered the ride there. The rejection fever had set in rapidly. It was a biological failsafe of their kind. When a bond was violently snapped, the body turned on itself, desperately trying to purge the spiritual infection of abandonment. She woke up in a large, unadorned bed, her body drenched in sweat, her muscles cramping so violently she bit her lip until it bled to keep from screaming. Drink. A deep voice rumbled beside her in the dim candlelight. Caleb's hand slid behind her neck, lifting her with surprising gentleness. He held a cup of foul-smelling herbal brew to her lips. She gagged at the bitter taste of wolf's bane and willow bark, but swallowed it down. Survival was not pretty. She knew that better than anyone. Growing up in the lawless, human-shifter borderlands, she had learned early that pride was a luxury for the protected. Thank you, she rasped, falling back against the pillows. Her chest heaved. For answering. Caleb sat back in a heavy wooden armchair beside the bed. In the low light, the scar cutting through his left eyebrow made him look fierce, unapproachable. Yet his scent, cedar and rain-washed earth, was incredibly calming. It wasn't the intoxicating, lightning-strike pull of David's scent, but it was safe. It was solid. You took a massive risk, Caleb said quietly, crossing his arms. If I had remained silent, the guards would have dragged you to the borders by sundown. You would have been meat for the rogues. I knew you wouldn't be silent, Lisa whispered, closing her eyes as the herbs began to dull the sharp edges of her agony. Oh? And how did you know that? Because you watch him, she said, her voice faint but steady. I saw the way you looked at him whenever he ignored me in the halls. You love him like a brother. But you know his flaws. You knew he was making a mistake. You wouldn't let him ruin a life just to stroke his own political ego. Silence stretched in the room, accompanied only by the crackle of the hearth fire. He did it for the kingdom, Caleb said eventually, though the defense sounded hollow even to him. Lord Vance of the Northern Ridge threatened to march his army south if David didn't honor the old betrothal pact with his daughter, Lady Seraphina. A mate bond complicates alliances. A king who bows to threats isn't a king, Lisa muttered, curling into a tight ball as another wave of shivers wrecked her frame. He's just a politician with a fancy chair. Caleb let out a low, breathy chuckle. It was a rare sound. You should probably refrain from treasonous talk while under my roof, little wolf. He stood, dipping a linen cloth into a basin of cold water. He wrung it out and carefully placed it across her burning forehead. His touch was entirely devoid of the hungry possessiveness she had felt radiating from David. It was an anchor. "Why did you do it, Caleb?" she asked, looking up at him through fever-bright eyes. "Truly. You defied him in front of the entire court. He could strip you of your rank." Caleb looked away, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. Fragments of the past few weeks played in his mind. The way Lisa had quietly thanked the lowest-ranking Omega servants. The way she had stood in the training yards, watching the warriors with sharp, analytical eyes instead of swooning over them. The sheer, terrifying bravery she had shown in the throne room, turning her deepest humiliation into a tactical maneuver to survive. "Because," Caleb said, his voice rough, "a king might need a queen of equal standing, but a warrior recognizes a survivor when he sees one." He looked back down at her. "Rest, Lisa. I will hold the door." 3 miles away, in the highest tower of the palace, David stood by his balcony, looking out over the dark canopy of the woods. His hands were braced against the stone parapet, the rock cracking slowly under his immense grip. He had expected relief. He had expected to feel the heavy burden of duty lightened, now that the complication of a peasant mate was resolved. Instead, his skin crawled. His wolf paced frantically beneath his skin, clawing at his chest, howling at the severed tether. And beneath the howling, a darker, uglier emotion was taking root. The image of Caleb's hands on her. The realization that she was currently in his best friend's bed, vulnerable, seeking the comfort he had viciously denied her. David closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to catch the faint scent of wildflowers on the wind. There was nothing. Just the cold, empty night. For the first time in his reign, the Alpha King felt the terrifying sting of true regret. It took 7 days for the fever to break entirely. 7 days of Caleb's quiet, steadfast presence. 7 days of Lisa rebuilding the shattered walls of her mind, piece by piece. On the 8th day, a royal summons arrived at Caleb's estate. It was written on thick parchment, stamped with the king's red wax seal. It was an invitation, which, in their world, was a mandatory command. To the grand autumn banquet. "Lord Vance and his daughter have arrived," Caleb explained, tossing the summons onto the wooden dining table where Lisa sat drinking black tea. She looked healthier now. The hollow circles under her eyes had faded, and her natural resilience had returned, bringing a sharp, defiant spark back to her gaze. "The prospective queen," Lisa said, her tone devoid of emotion. "And he wants you there to stand behind him and look intimidating. He wants us there." Caleb corrected, tapping the parchment. Lisa froze, the teacup halting halfway to her mouth. She looked down at the looping script. It clearly requested the presence of General Caleb and his ward. "He's testing the waters. Caleb said, leaning against the counter. He wants to see the fallout of his decision. He wants to see you broken, Lisa. He needs to validate his choice. Lisa set the cup down with a sharp clink. The phantom ache in her chest flared, a dull throb reminding her of the man who had ripped her soul in half. But the pain was quickly eclipsed by a burning, icy pride. "Then we shouldn't disappoint him," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, silken register. "We should give him exactly what he wants to see." That evening, the grand hall was a sea of velvet, gold, and glittering jewels. Alpha Vance of the Northern Ridge held court near the center, a boisterous, heavily scarred man who laughed too loudly. Beside him stood Lady Seraphina, tall, elegant, with hair the color of spun gold and the haughty, cold scent of winter frost. She was everything David had claimed he needed. David sat on his throne, a goblet of dark wine untouched in his hand. He looked immaculate in a tailored midnight blue suit, his crown resting heavily on his dark hair. But his eyes were restless. He barely listened to the sycophantic chatter of the northern lords. His gaze kept dragging to the massive double doors. He told himself he just wanted to ensure the transition was peaceful. He told himself he wanted to see that the rogue female was adequately cared for so his conscience could rest. When the heavy doors finally swung open, the murmurs in the hall died instantly. Caleb entered first, wearing his formal military dress, black tunic, silver wolf head clasps, looking every inch the lethal predator that kept David's enemies awake at night. But it was the woman on his arm that sucked the oxygen from the room. Lisa wore a gown of deep, rich crimson, a color traditionally reserved for the bloodline of alpha elites, a color she had strictly avoided during her short stay in the palace. It clung to her curves, elegant but defiant. Her dark hair, usually braided away to hide, was swept over one shoulder, exposing the smooth column of her neck. She looked nothing like a rejected mate. She looked like a conqueror. David's breath hitched. His wolf slammed against his ribs, a frantic, possessive roar echoing in his mind. Mine? No. David forced the beast down, his knuckles turning white on his goblet. You threw her away. He watched, paralyzed, as Caleb leaned down, whispering something near Lisa's ear. Whatever he said made a small, genuine smile touch her lips. The sight of it, a smile she had never given him, felt like a physical blade sliding between David's ribs. He didn't realize he was standing until his chair scraped loudly against the dais. The hall went dead silent again. Lady Seraphina paused mid-sentence, looking up at him in confusion. David descended the steps, his strides long and predatory. The crowd parted for him instinctively, the oppressive weight of his alpha aura flaring so intensely that weaker wolves had to look at the floor. He stopped a mere 3 feet from Caleb and Lisa. Up close, the mingled scent of them hit him. It wasn't the scent of mated pair, not yet. But the scent of his best friend was permanently layered over the wildflowers and rain. It was a territorial marker. "General," David said, his voice tight, lacking its usual smooth authority, "you honor us with your presence." "My king." Caleb inclined his head respectfully, but he did not step back. He kept Lisa securely tucked against his side. David's gaze shifted to Lisa. He searched her eyes for the devastation he had caused, for a flicker of the desperate girl who had stood in his throne room a week ago. He found nothing but cool, unbothered amber. "Lisa," David said, her name tasting like ash on his tongue. "You look recovered." "I am remarkably resilient, Your Majesty," she replied, her tone perfectly polite, perfectly distant. "I have General Caleb to thank for his exceptional hospitality." David's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ground together. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to grab her wrist, pull her away from the towering shadow of his friend, and drag her back up to the dais where she belonged. "She doesn't belong there anymore," his rational mind screamed. "You made your choice." "Indeed," David murmured, his dark eyes flickering to Caleb. The camaraderie they had shared since childhood was suddenly absent, replaced by a tense, electric rivalry. "Ensure you do not overstep your bounds, Caleb. Hospitality is one thing. Claiming what is not yours is another." Caleb's expression hardened. "With all due respect, my king," he said, his voice dropping so only the three of them could hear. "She was yours to throw away. But she is no longer yours to dictate." David's eyes flared black. The wine goblet in his hand shattered, dark liquid and glass raining down onto the pristine marble floor. The sharp, chaotic crack of shattering glass brought the grand hall to a standstill. Music died in the throats of the string quartet. Laughter dissolved into thick, suffocating silence. The dark wine bled across the white marble like an open wound, pooling around the king's polished boots. David didn't look down. His chest rose and fell in rigid, calculated intervals, fighting the feral urge to shift and tear his best friend's throat out in front of the entire northern delegation. "A faulty stem," David said, his voice terrifyingly calm, slicing through the dead air. He signaled a trembling servant with a flick of his wrist. "Clean this. Let the music resume." The command broke the spell. The quartet scrambled to play a hurried, slightly off-tempo waltz. The courtiers resumed their conversations in hushed, nervous whispers, their eyes darting constantly toward the triad standing at the edge of the dais. Lady Seraphina glided down the steps, the heavy silk of her icy blue gown rustling like frost over dead grass. She slipped her arm through David's, her pale hand resting possessively over the dark fabric of his sleeve. She did not look at Lisa with jealousy. She looked at her with the cold, assessing gaze of a predator measuring a potential threat. "Oh, my king," Seraphina purred, her scent, crushed mint and freezing rain, spiking sharply to mask the bitter ozone of David's anger. "The floor is waiting. You promised me the opening waltz." David tore his eyes away from Lisa, staring down at the woman he had chosen for her army and her lineage. She was flawlessly beautiful, entirely poised, and completely devoid of warmth. A perfect queen for a frozen kingdom. "Of course," David murmured, his jaw still painfully tight. He allowed Seraphina to lead him toward the center of the room. As the king departed, Caleb released a breath he seemed to have been holding for a century. The rigid tension in his broad shoulders eased a fraction. He turned to Lisa, his gray eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "My heart is still beating, if that's what you mean," Lisa replied, letting out a shaky exhale. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving a cold ache in its wake. "He looked like he wanted to kill you, Caleb." "He's realizing that a crown doesn't make a man immune to consequences," Caleb said, offering his hand. "Come. If we stand here, we look like prey. We dance." Lisa placed her hand in his. Caleb's palm was rough with weapon calluses, hot and grounding. He led her onto the floor, pulling her into the traditional, measured steps of the waltz. He kept a respectful distance between them, mindful of the hundreds of eyes tracking their every movement. For a few minutes, there was only the music, the sweeping motion of the dance, and the steady, reassuring rhythm of Caleb's heartbeat beneath her palm. He was a wall between her and the venomous whispers of the court. Then, the music shifted. It was the valsa di trocca, the changing waltz, a traditional dance where partners swapped at the crescendo, a symbol of pack unity and fluid alliances. Lisa felt a sudden, terrifying spike of predatory energy at her back. Before Caleb could tighten his grip to keep her, a hand closed like an iron vice over Lisa's bare shoulder. "My turn, General," David's voice hissed in her ear. Caleb's eyes flashed a dangerous, wolfish gold, his hand locking onto David's wrist. For a split second, the two most powerful warriors in the kingdom stood frozen, a hair's breadth away from a bloodbath on the ballroom floor. "Caleb," Lisa whispered, squeezing his hand. "It's fine. It's just a dance." Reluctantly, agonizingly, Caleb released her. He stepped back, taking the hand of a smirking Lady Serafina, who looked entirely too pleased by the masculine display of aggression. David pulled Lisa flush against his chest, entirely ignoring the customary space between dance partners. His scent enveloped her instantly, lightning, ozone, and dark pine. 3 weeks ago, it would have sent her into a euphoric, submissive haze. Now, it just made her feel trapped. "What game are you playing, Lisa?" David demanded, sweeping her into a dizzying turn that took them away from the center of the crowd. "I'm not playing anything, Your Majesty," she said, keeping her chin raised, staring rigidly at the knot of his tie. "I am surviving, as you instructed." "With Caleb?" The name was a venomous spit. His hand on her waist tightened bruisingly. "Do you think I don't know what you're doing? You're using my oldest friend to punish me. You're parading yourself in front of me in elite colors to show me what I threw away." Lisa finally looked up, meeting his pitch-black eyes. "You flatter yourself, David. I wear red because I like it. I am with Caleb because he was the only man in your entire wretched court with the honor to catch me when you dropped me. I did what I had to do for my people." David hissed, his control fraying. Vance would have slaughtered thousands at the border. And what kind of king trades the soul of his mate to save his own borders? Lisa countered softly, her words a surgical strike. "A coward, David. You are a coward." David stumbled, missing a step in the waltz. The insult, delivered not with a scream, but with pitying certainty, gutted him. He looked down at her, the mask of the ruthless king crumbling to reveal the desperate, fragmented man beneath. "I can fix this," David breathed, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The alpha command was gone, replaced by raw pleading. "I can set you up in a private estate, the finest in the capital. You will want for nothing. I will visit you every night. Serafina will only be a queen in name." Lisa tore herself out of his grip, stepping back so quickly she nearly tripped over the hem of her gown. The music seemed to fade into a hollow ringing in her ears. "You want me as your hidden mistress," she whispered, the sheer audacity of the proposition turning her blood to ice. "You want to keep your political throne and keep me locked in a gilded cage in the shadows. Lisa, do not touch me," she warned, her voice vibrating with a primal, deeply buried power that made David pause. "You severed the bond, David. You made your choice. Learn to live with the ghost of it, because you will never, ever have me again." She turned her back on the king of the realm, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the crowded dance floor, a hollow sovereign ruling over ashes. The atmosphere at Caleb's estate was thick with unspoken tension over the next 3 days. The grand ballroom confrontation had drawn a permanent line in the sand. By openly rejecting David's proposition and returning with Caleb, Lisa had cemented her position not just as a survivor, but as a political anomaly, and anomalies in the Alpha King's court rarely survived long. It was mid-afternoon. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. Caleb was in the clearing behind the estate, stripped to the waist, driving a heavy broadsword into a series of wooden practice dummies. The rhythmic thwack, splinter thwack, was a violent release of the pent-up frustration he'd carried since the banquet. Lisa sat on the porch steps, watching him. She noted the fluid, lethal grace of his movements, the way his muscles bunched and released with practiced efficiency. There was no showing off. It was pure, brutal survival mechanics. "You're dropping your left guard on the backswing," she called out suddenly, her voice cutting through the crisp air. Caleb froze mid-swing. He lowered the heavy blade, turning to look at her over his shoulder, his scarred eyebrow arching in surprise. Sweat glistened on his collarbones. "Excuse me?" Lisa stood, dusting off her practical linen trousers, a sharp contrast to the crimson gown she had worn days prior. She walked over to the weapon rack, selecting a lighter, curved, short sword. "Borderland rogues don't fight with honor," she said, tossing the blade lightly from hand to test the balance. "They wait for the backswing. When you pull the claymore back, your left flank is exposed for exactly 1.2 seconds, long enough for a dagger to slip between your ribs." Caleb turned fully now, resting his massive sword in the dirt. A genuine, intrigued smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "And how does a supposedly helpless rogue-born female know the exact timing of a claymore's backswing?" "Helpless?" Lisa laughed, a bright, startling sound that made Caleb's chest tight. "David assumed I was helpless because I didn't know which fork to use for oysters. But you don't survive 20 years on the lawless fringes by swooning. You survive by knowing how to bleed an enemy before he bleeds you." She stepped into the clearing, raising the short sword. "Show me." For the next hour, the air was filled with the ring of steel. Caleb held back at first, terrified of hurting her, but Lisa quickly proved she didn't need his coddling. She was fast, terrifyingly fast, using her smaller stature to slip beneath his heavy guard, her blade stopping mere inches from his throat on 3 separate occasions. It was a dance far more intimate than the waltz at the palace. It was a language of breath, sweat, and absolute trust. "You're holding back," Lisa panted, parrying a slow overhead strike. "You are my king's discarded mate, and my ward under sanctuary." Caleb growled playfully, stepping in close. "I am trying not to break you." "I am already broken," she whispered, the playful banter fading as she looked up into his stormy gray eyes. "I'm just rearranging the pieces." The air between them suddenly shifted, the metallic scent of combat giving way to something softer, warmer. Caleb looked down at her, the heavy sword forgotten in his hand. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. He leaned in, the invisible magnetic pull between them growing undeniable. A twig snapped in the tree line. It wasn't a natural sound. It was the heavy, deliberate crunch of a boot. Caleb's demeanor changed in a microsecond. The softness vanished, replaced by the lethal, ice-cold general of the king's army. He grabbed Lisa by the waist, violently pulling her behind him just as a thick, black-fletched arrow embedded itself into the wooden dummy where she had been standing a second before. "Inside!" Caleb roared, bringing his claymore up, but they were already surrounded. 5 men dropped from the canopy of the autumn trees. They weren't ragged borderland rogues. They wore darkened leather armor, their faces concealed by masks, and they moved with military precision. Assassins. "Take the female," the leader barked. "Leave the general if you can. Kill him if you must." Caleb didn't wait for them to strike. He surged forward, a terrifying force of nature. His claymore cleaved through the first assassin's defense, dropping him instantly. But the others were coordinated. They boxed him in, using long spears to keep his devastating reach at bay, while 2 peeled off to flank Lisa. Lisa didn't run for the house. She spun the short sword in her hand, ducking under a wildly swung dagger from the closest attacker. She drove the pommel of her sword into his knee, dropping him, then brought the hilt down viciously on the back of his neck. He went still. "Lisa, get in the house," Caleb bellowed, parrying a spear thrust. "I am not a damsel, Caleb," she shouted back, deflecting a blow from the 3rd man. She was skilled, but she was outmatched in sheer brute strength. The assassin lunged, his blade catching the edge of her sword, twisting it violently out of her grip. He raised his dagger, aiming for her chest. Lisa braced for the impact, but it never came. A massive shadow eclipsed her. Caleb had abandoned his defense, taking a spear thrust to his side to close the distance. He grabbed the assassin by the throat, lifting him entirely off the ground and throwing him into the trunk of a massive oak tree with a sickening crunch. The remaining assassin took one look at Caleb's glowing, murderous eyes and the blood pouring from his flank, dropped his weapon, and fled into the woods. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by Caleb's ragged breathing. He stood over Lisa, his hand pressing against his side where dark crimson was rapidly soaking through his trousers. "Caleb," Lisa breathed, falling to her knees beside him as he suddenly swayed and collapsed into the dirt. "I told you," Caleb rasped, a bloody smile on his lips as he looked up at her terrified face. "I'm your protector." She pressed her hands over his wound, her fingers coming away slick with his blood. As she tore the hem of her shirt to pack the wound, her eyes caught the hilt of the dropped dagger belonging to the fleeing assassin. Carved into the dark steel was a sigil, a white wolf howling over a jagged peak. The crest of the northern ridge, Alpha Vance. They weren't trying to kill the king's best friend. They were clearing the board of the only threat to Lady Seraphina's undisputed rule. The heavy oak doors of the royal war room slammed open so violently the hinges shrieked. David stood in the threshold, looking like a man who had been dragged backward through hell. His perfectly tailored suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes, usually a composed, fathomless black, were bleeding into the luminous, unstable gold of a wolf teetering on the edge of a feral shift. Alpha Vance, who had been pointing at a map of the borderlands, paused mid-sentence. Lady Seraphina, seated elegantly by the fireplace, looked up with a delicate, annoyed frown. "Your Majesty," Vance boomed, trying to mask his unease with forced joviality. "We were just discussing the troop deployments for the wedding day." "Get out," David said. His voice wasn't a roar, it was a deadly vibrating whisper that made the glass decanters on the table rattle. "My king?" Vance asked, his smile faltering. "Everyone but Vance and Seraphina out of my sight, now." The royal advisors and generals didn't hesitate. They practically sprinted from the room, leaving the Northern Lord and his daughter alone with a dangerously unstable sovereign. David crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing the heavy oak table and violently flipping it. Maps, Inkwells and carved wooden markers scattered across the stone floor in a chaotic explosion. Serafina gasped, pressing herself back into her chair. "An attack," David hissed, stalking toward Vance. "On my lands, on my general's estate." Vance swallowed hard, though he kept his chin jutted out. "The border rogues have been growing bold, Your Majesty. It only proves my point that we must unify our armies immediately." "Do not insult my intelligence, Vance," David snarled, closing the distance until he was inches from the older Alpha's face. The oppressive weight of David's aura bore down on the room, suffocating, crushing. Border rogues do not wield northern steel. They do not know the patrol gaps around Caleb's property. You accuse me of treason." Vance blustered, though a bead of sweat rolled down his scarred temple. "I am accusing you of missing," David said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, psychotic calm. "You sent assassins to kill my mate. She is an unbonded rogue." Serafina snapped, finally losing her icy composure. She stood up, her blue eyes flashing. "She is a distraction. You humiliate us by allowing her to parade around the capital in elite colors while you hesitate on our betrothal. My father did what was necessary to secure the crown." David slowly turned his head to look at Serafina, the woman he had fractured his own soul to secure. She looked ugly to him now, cold, hollow, and vicious. "You think you can rule beside me?" David asked softly, stepping away from Vance and moving toward her. "You think you can sit on that throne while her blood is on your hands?" "It is the way of our kind, David," Serafina said, lifting her chin, though her voice trembled under his gaze. "Weakness must be excised." David stared at her for a long, terrible moment. The political cage he had built for himself was suddenly perfectly visible. He had traded a loyal, fierce mate for a den of vipers. He had broken Lisa to save his kingdom, only to invite the real monsters through the front door. "Pack your things," David said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Vance stepped forward. "You cannot do this. The Alliance is dead," David roared, the sound tearing from his throat like a physical weapon. "Take your daughter and ride north before the sun sets. If I see your banners on my lands by nightfall, I will not send an army. I will come for you myself, and I will burn the northern ridge to the ground." He didn't wait to see their reactions. He turned on his heel and strode out of the war room, his mind singularly focused. He had to get to the estate. He had to see if she was alive. The ride to Caleb's lands was a blur of thundering hooves and blinding panic. When David finally threw himself off his lathered horse in the courtyard, the sharp, metallic tang of blood hit his senses. He burst through the front door of the cabin, the wood splintering around the lock. "Lisa," he found them in the main living area. Caleb was shirtless, sitting heavily in a chair, a massive blood-soaked bandage wrapped tightly around his midsection. Lisa was kneeling between his legs, her hands stained with crimson, carefully knotting the linen. They both froze, looking up at the king. David's breath hitched. She was alive. She was unharmed. A wave of profound, debilitating relief washed over him, so intense it nearly dropped him to his knees. But then he registered the scene before him. Lisa wasn't looking at Caleb with the desperate gratitude of a ward. Her hands lingered on his skin. Her scent, previously spiked with fear, was mellowing into something deeply intimate, mingling flawlessly with Caleb's cedar and rain. The protective barrier Caleb had thrown around her was calcifying into something permanent. A choice. A true bond, forged not by fate, but by fire and blood. "Now get away from him," David commanded, the ugly, possessive beast clawing its way back to the surface. Lisa didn't move. She tied off the bandage, her eyes locked on David. "You don't give orders in this house, David." "You are coming back to the palace," David said, taking a step toward her. "Vance sent the assassins. I have banished him. The betrothal is broken. It's safe now. You can come home." "Home?" Lisa repeated, the word dripping with venom. She slowly stood up, placing herself firmly between the bleeding general and the Alpha King. "The palace was never my home. It was a holding cell until you decided to execute my heart." "I made a mistake," David pleaded, his voice cracking, the formidable king reduced to a desperate, starving man. "Lisa, please. The bond is dead, David," Lisa said softly, but with absolute crushing finality. "You killed it. And in its place, I found something real." She reached back, her small, blood-stained hand finding Caleb's massive one. He gripped her fingers tightly. David stared at their joined hands. The last thread of his sanity, frayed by regret and pulled taut by the terror, finally snapped. "No," David whispered, his eyes going entirely black. "I am the king, and I say what is mine." He drew his royal sword, the polished steel hissing against the leather scabbard. "If I have to burn this entire forest down to cut you out of it, Caleb, I will." The metallic hiss of David's sword leaving its scabbard was a sound Caleb knew intimately. It was the sound of a death sentence. For 2 decades, they had fought back to back, a symphony of synchronized violence that kept the kingdom's enemies at bay. Now, the point of that legendary blade was leveled squarely at Caleb's chest. "Put the sword down, David," Caleb warned, his voice dangerously low. Despite the gaping wound in his side and the rapid loss of blood, the general did not flinch. He slowly rose from the chair, pushing Lisa gently but firmly behind him. "You are not thinking clearly. The feral shift is blinding you." "I see perfectly," David snarled, his eyes a terrifying, luminous gold that bled into the whites. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating beneath the crushing weight of the king's unbridled alpha aura. "I see a traitor. I see a thief who took advantage of a fractured bond to steal what belongs to the crown." "Belongs?" Lisa echoed, the word tearing from her throat with sudden, explosive fury. She stepped out from behind Caleb's massive frame, her amber eyes burning with a fierce, untamed light. "I am not a crown jewel, David. I am not a piece of land to be traded and reclaimed when it suits your politics. You threw me to the wolves. Caleb became the shield you refused to be. I did it to save the borders," David roared, the desperate justification cracking under the weight of his guilt. "I did it for my people." "Then go be with your people," Caleb said, his breathing shallow, but his stance immaculate, perfectly balanced for a lethal strike despite his unarmed state. "Because she is no longer part of your kingdom. She is under my protection, and if you want to take her, you will have to step over my corpse to do it." David's hand trembled on the hilt of his sword. The blade wavered. A profound, shattering agony warred with the feral rage inside him. He looked at Caleb, the man who had carried him off the battlefield at the ridge, the man who had kept his secrets, his brother in every way that mattered. Then he looked at Lisa. She wasn't cowering. She was standing shoulder to shoulder with Caleb, her hand resting protectively on his uninjured hip. The primal energy radiating from them wasn't just sanctuary anymore. It was the nascent hum of a true, chosen mating bond taking root. It was stronger than the thread of fate David had severed. It was built on respect, sacrifice, and survival. "I can kill you both," David whispered, though the words sounded hollow, stripped of their power. "I am the Alpha King." "Then do it," Lisa challenged, taking a deliberate step forward until the razor-sharp tip of David's sword rested against the linen of her collarbone. A tiny bead of crimson bloomed where the steel met her skin. Caleb lunged, a feral growl tearing from his throat. But Lisa held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. Her eyes never left David's. "Do it," she repeated, her voice dropping to a haunting, melodic calm. "Drive the blade home, David. Prove that you are exactly the monster the Borderlands whisper about. Kill your best friend. Kill the woman the fates gave you. Rule over a graveyard of your own making, completely alone." David stared at the single drop of blood on her collarbone. It was the brightest, most terrifying thing he had ever seen. The metallic scent of it hit his senses, cutting through the ozone of his rage. It broke him. The feral gold in his eyes shattered, replaced by the fathomless, grief-stricken black of a man waking up to a nightmare of his own design. The sword slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the wooden floorboards. David stumbled backward, his hands coming up to cover his face as a ragged, tearing sound ripped from his chest. It wasn't a roar. It was a sob. The Alpha King, the most powerful predator on the continent, collapsed to his knees amid the splintered wood of Caleb's cabin. "I'm sorry," David choked out, the words muffled by his hands, his broad shoulders shaking violently. "Gods, Lisa, I am so sorry." Lisa looked down at the broken sovereign. The phantom ache in her chest, the remnants of their severed bond, flickered one last time before going entirely quiet. There was no hatred left in her, only a profound, heavy pity. "I forgive you, David," she said softly, the words ringing with absolute finality. "But I will never return to you. My place is here." David lowered his hands, looking up at her with hollow, devastated eyes. He slowly nodded, accepting the crushing weight of his consequence. He stood up, avoiding Caleb's gaze. The camaraderie of a lifetime burned to ashes on the floor between them. Without another word, the king turned and walked out into the cold autumn night, leaving the warmth of the cabin behind him forever. The tragic, sweeping romance of Alpha King David, his discarded mate Lisa, and the steadfast General Caleb serves as a powerful reminder that power and duty can often exact the highest of personal costs. True loyalty and love cannot be bartered for political gain. And sometimes, the greatest act of love a king can perform is simply letting go and living with the ashes of his choices. If this dramatic tale of shifting alliances, broken bonds, and the fiery consequences of a king's regret captured your heart, please like this story, share it with your fellow fantasy romance readers, and subscribe for more thrilling, immersive fiction. Let us know in the comments whose side you were on. Did David deserve his lonely throne?